Hello and welcome to the ETTelecom panel discussion. Today we have Mr. Robert Lee, Managing Director of Verizon Asia Pacific, and Mr. Sanchit Veergogia, Chief Analyst and CEO of Greyhound Research, to talk about the increased data traffic on telecom networks as well as growing cybersecurity attacks while the majority of people work from home in the wake of current lockdown due to coronavirus pandemic. So now over to you, Sanchit.
Right. Thank you, Mantazir, and good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for joining in from wherever you have. It's glad to know that all of you are doing well, all of you doing safe, and all of you doing fine. These are very unprecedented times, and as I was speaking to a very large client yesterday, it's a large private equity firm. What we were talking about is that how there are really no playbooks. There is very little reference material to go at and sort of learn from. So, what we've done is I've sort of made a small PPT. I don't want to do a death by PPT, but a very quick reference material as to what we are hearing from the ground, what are some of our customers talking about, and ultimately how you can go back sort of to your respective jobs and sort of use some of this material and probably having more informed conversations and probably even using it at some stage with some of your clients. So just to give you a sense, really you're not alone in battling this, and I know you've heard this over and over again. But the reason I wanted to sort of share this with you is because starting early February until yesterday, we as an analyst firm have done over 100 plus end user inquiry calls, and these have been with companies that sort of spend northwards of $300 million on technology, give and take. The consistent feedback, of course, has been twofold. One, of course, has been that there is absolute panic because, as I said, there are no playbooks. Organizations and leaders are worried about sort of taking the wrong calls on behalf of the employees, are worried about taking the wrong calls in terms of the technology that they're implementing, and ultimately, don't ultimately want to be held responsible for doing something wrong on behalf of the organization. What's also sort of really worrying for them right now is how do we manage business continuity at all points in time so that our customers and their customers in turn are not hurt at all in the process. So I'll talk more about this in the coming minutes. But I would love to sort of share with you an interesting reference case study that we have. If you remember the SARS virus outbreak back in 2000, it is sort of a go-to example of how Alibaba and e-commerce really took off in China purely because of the SARS virus outbreak. So in many ways, coronavirus is similar, if not the same. I know the magnitude is way higher, but if you speak to any boards, any chairmen today, they consistently talk about how a reversal from this is very much possible, how they talk about consistently as to they're using technology to not just collaborate within the teams, but help employees become a lot more smarter, leaner in their functions. So there's ample ground, I believe, that a lot of us will come out, transformed, stronger, and in eventuality, those of us who will be left in the industry will look a lot leaner and better. So in terms of the feedback that we have from the industry so far, there are clearly four buckets of feedback. I remember back in time when in early February, when we started getting a ton of questions from organizations, it was all about pure basics. The questions actually included how do we operationalize work from home? Are my people going to be ready to be able to collaborate with each other remotely? How do I give access to content? How do I ensure secure access? Because ultimately, employees will be using their own devices. What we also heard about was a process readiness, especially in the ITES sector, where a lot of the work could not be actually initially moved from home sites, and there was a ton of compliance, and there still is a ton of compliance for them to comply with. So how do we go back to our clients, contract, sort of recontract and renegotiate the terms? And ultimately, in a scenario of wherein our teams are dispersed across different locations, how do we ensure outcomes at all given points in time? Do we have new project management modules? And all of these questions actually poured in. So sort of makes sense of where we are in the industry today. What we've sort of come up with is something called the industry readiness matrix. Now, this is an evolving matrix, and the reason I mention that is because a lot of the organizations today are in the midst of implementing new technology. So you might see that some of these sectors here that I speak about today actually will be moving in journey from, let's say, from low to medium, or medium to high technology readiness, or maybe from, let's say, low to medium business readiness. So just to give you and share with you some examples which are very close home to in India right now, what we've seen is a big uptick today on how e-commerce companies would like to use a lot more technology in terms of operationalizing their supply chain, in terms of operationalizing their warehouses, and more importantly, the questions we are getting today from them are, just to give you a sense, can we use robotic warehousing? What will it need from a network standpoint? Can my robotic warehousing bots actually be hacked at all? For example, another question we got just yesterday was, how do we sort of train our people to work in human exclusion zones? So these are some of the questions that we're getting from industries which are very eager to sort of adopt more technology to actually come out stronger from this industry, from this episode, sorry. Another interesting example that I'd love to sort of share with you is of one of the India's largest luxury chain hotels. So right now we are working very closely with them from a digital transformation standpoint. And what they're looking at this event, at this world event, is an opportunity to come back even stronger. So they have a dozen luxury hotels in the country right now. And until last year, they had no plans to sort of redo their websites, put in a new reservation system. But the moment this episode has occurred, they've gone all the more bullish. And what they're now trying to do is to completely transform, be a lot more ready from a technology standpoint, and actually also work on their business models in the course of coming months so as to sort of prepare better for the coming quarters, which is especially October, November, December quarters, where they are very certain that the demand will come back. So net, what you would see in this matrix are how different sorts of industries are placed from a readiness standpoint to sort of respond better to this COVID outbreak. Another interesting example that's very close home to us in India is education. I'm very closely involved in the digital transformation strategy again with a large publishing house, and they have a very unique problem statement. Their problem statement is that while we have the content, we have the authors. So essentially, we, from a business readiness standpoint, we're up there. We are very mature. So they have the partners, they have established relationships, they have their prices worked out. But what they really are worried about today, that they have absolutely no way to disseminate ebooks in a seamless fashion across all the student base. What they're also really worried about today as to when in the eventuality all the ebooks are out, will their physical books even be relevant? Another question as part of the ongoing conversations with them is that if at all we do make an online portal, how do we get people to sort of start logging into the portal to read our content? How should we think about the cybersecurity scenarios? The fact that today teachers are also having to work from home, should we have differentiated modules or differentiated deliveries models for teachers? So these are some of the questions that I think which are very prevalent for a lot of industries, especially education today. Another industry which I think is very fascinatingly developing today is healthcare. Now, healthcare, of course, is very high when it comes to its ability to be able to respond to such conditions. Of course, this is a exceptional scenario, so we cannot take this as a benchmark as to how the likes of the NHS and other health organizations are responding. But at any given point in time, the first responders are very well equipped. to handle any crisis of any nature. But in scenarios like this, where they're having to sort of deal with billions and billions of people at scale, with repeat cases of coronavirus or having to do repeat tests, their worries are pretty simplistic, actually. While they have the workforce, they may even have, in the eventuality, the PPE or the protective gear. But what they do not have today are actually applications that can help enable their jobs. What they don't necessarily have today are networks that are always up there and sort of secure all the time. So what we're seeing is different degrees of concern with different sorts of industries. For example, if on the bottom left, if you see are industries like construction and real estate, that industry has completely come to a grinding halt. And what they're sort of now trying to find out is leaner ways of using technology. Maybe, let's say, from a rental point of view, one of the queries we got was that how do we operationalize the entire visual 360-degree experience of, let's say, our rental properties? How can we sort of give people the augmented reality or the virtual reality view of the property that we want to rent them out? So interesting sort of use cases coming out. Net, what is very certain that while in the next 6 months, there's definitely going to be a hard hit across most industries, other than select industries like e-commerce and ITES, which are sort of up there in terms of maturity. But most sectors, broad and wide, will be impacted. But if any conversation that you have today sort of also highlights one bottom line, which is that technology and digital is going to be probably the only differentiator here on. And that's pretty much what sort of gives comfort that the industry will sort of come back in a very strong way, if not in the next 6 months, but definitely by October, November, December. So before I sort of move on and sort of end my 5-7 minutes of slot here, I want to leave you with some interesting thoughts I had this morning. So yesterday, again, I was on a call with this very large private equity and a few bankers, and that's how I summarized my discussion with them. That you cannot transform for tomorrow, and tomorrow in this case is the post-COVID world. In today's days, using yesterday's mindset. So that's it from me. And Rob, over to you, please now.
Thank you very much, Sanchit. It's a great pleasure to hear from you, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join this session today. For those that aren't familiar, Verizon is headquartered in the United States. We're one of the world's largest technology companies, providing telecommunications, connectivity, customer experience technologies, as well as cybersecurity services for enterprises and governments all around the world. In the Asia Pacific region, we have approximately 10,000 employees spread throughout the region, many of which operate and work in the Indian market as well. It's an important market for us, one that we've been operating in for many years. I myself am based in Sydney, but outside of the COVID restrictions, I'm a very regular visitor to India over the last number of years. So similar to what Sanchit covered, I wanted to really talk about two things. The first was some observations around technology and the way that it can assist companies move through the pandemic response. And we'll talk about some of the phases that we're seeing around technology adoption. And then I'll spend a few minutes talking specifically about some of the cybersecurity considerations operating in this environment, some practical advice, hopefully, for organizations to think about in this new way of operating when they're considering their cybersecurity posture overall. So as Sanchit touched on it earlier on, we're seeing three really clear characterizations of companies and organizations in dealing with the pandemic. Some of them at the moment are currently just figuring out how they survive. There are other organizations that are clearly in the phase of thinking about revival and recovery. So once we move out of government mandated lockdowns and compressed economic conditions, what will happen to my business? How will it change? And then there's a very small group of companies that actually see this as a tremendous opportunity. And they're asking themselves, how do I thrive in this environment? How do I create positive change and use that as a springboard for my business? So in the survival phase, organizations really have to ask themselves a couple of key questions. The first is, how do I enable my workforce? And technology considerations around that are things like, do I have the right type of VPN access for home workers or remote workers that previously would have been working from an office environment? Have I got the right collaboration tools so they can speak not only with themselves and amongst their teams, but also with their customers? How are they engaging with customers securely in a manner that makes sense for their industry? And then the third piece is all of that communication and that new data flow secure. And so one of the key areas that organizations have started to consider and accelerate in terms of investment is endpoint protection. So all of those VPN endpoints, all of those remote access endpoints now become potential vulnerabilities for cybersecurity that organizations need to consider. And similar to what Sanchit referenced, in certain sectors like ITES, there's an additional consideration, which is if I'm changing the way that my business is operating very rapidly, can I ensure that I'm still in compliance with policies and governmental controls that are required either of my organization or of my customers in places like the United States and elsewhere? So these are really important considerations, and they're the ones that organizations are considering very carefully in the immediate term as they shore up their defenses and create a new base for them to operate. If we move on to how organizations think about their revival or recovery, it's really about considering, is there a new normal for my business? In some cases, there may not be. Many people would argue that in a lot of cases, there will be new operating principles. Typically, organizations, as they look to come out of the response to the pandemic, whether that's in 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months, we all hope that it will be sooner rather than later. A couple of key things will be true. The first is that many organizations will be very capital constrained. Many will also be working with very limited cash flow or negative cash flow as they seek to rebuild that aspect of their business. And in some cases, they'll be working with limited or reduced workforces because they've had to cut some of those workforces as they've responded to the pandemic as well. So the questions that organizations need to ask themselves in that environment, firstly, is which technology can help me to re-energize and accelerate my business forward? As an example, it's a great time for organizations to think about technologies to transform customer experience and customer interaction. We've all had to, in some way, shape or form, had to move our organizations and our customer interactions far more towards a digital orientation as a response to the pandemic. And so are the technologies that I have been utilizing to help digitize my customer engagement during the pandemic response, are they now valuable for me on an ongoing basis to help transform the way that I engage and communicate with my customers? The second one that they need to think about is technology consumption and different types of models for organizations to purchase and consume technology on an on-demand basis as they seek to manage their cash flow more dynamically. And then the third question as organizations seek to revive is, does this present an opportunity for me to leapfrog technology? And what new technologies are there out there that could help my organization to seize a competitive advantage or perhaps capture additional market share? I spoke with a tech company this morning that operates globally that is using their response to the pandemic as a great chance to think about technologies like VR and whether that is an opportunity for them to create true virtual teaming using that technology as opposed to bringing people back into the physical workplace. That's just one example. Another example that we've started to speak with some customers about is the power of 5G and next generation wireless technology. And what does that mean for my organization? What can I leverage and empower in changes in the way that either my own business processes work, my applications perform, or my customers interact with my organization? That again can create a competitive advantage for me. And then that very small group of customers, albeit very forward thinking, that are looking on this as an opportunity to thrive, an opportunity to establish new markets, capture market share, accelerate customer acquisition. And typically these are organizations that have already had a very strong digital engagement strategy, who are somewhat ahead of the game in that regard, who are seeking to use these technologies and this opportunity to strengthen the relationship with their customers, whether it's a retail customer or an enterprise customer, through these digital channels. So it's an opportunity at the moment and a period where there are a great number of decisions to be made and a great number of complexities for organisations, both big and small, to think about in their response. Central to that is, how do I continue to care for my customers, and how do I continue to provide products and services to them so that they maintain that relationship with my organisation. That's true for an online retailer in as much as it is for a travel aggregator or a financial services organisation. Those questions are central to any company in their response to the pandemic. The other key question to ask is to focus on what are the new cybersecurity threats and attack vectors or potential attack vectors that I need to consider as my business operating model changes. Now, most organisations, let's use the banking and financial services sector, which traditionally has not had a strong work from home or remote worker culture, are now having to adjust very rapidly to that reality. And so those considerations that I spoke about before, particularly around endpoint protection, data flow protection, not only out through VPN connections, but also to cloud-based applications, become even more important than ever. And understanding exactly what cybersecurity management protocols you have around that becomes very important. One interesting consideration that we've observed is that Verizon operates one of the world's largest non-military and non-government cyber threat analytics centers. So we spend a lot of time analysing threats in cyberspace and understanding what they mean for businesses, enterprises and governments. In the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen more than 57,000 new domain registrations with the word COVID somewhere in the title. Now, that's a very strong indicator to there being an increase in malicious activity coming from those domain name sites. So a piece of practical advice for organisations as they respond and as they think about all of the changes that they need to manage is to step up significantly the level of education that they have around things like social engineering attacks and malicious mail campaigns. It would be a piece of advice to perhaps educate people around emails coming from coronavirus-related websites, as an example, and making sure that your employees aren't actively opening those websites unless they're very sure and can verify where that has come from. It could contain malicious information or software that could be launched into the network. The other piece of very practical advice that we would consider when companies look at their remote workforce is around VPN enablement and ensuring that there's two-factor authentication as a security layer across that virtual private network and across those access points. That's a very important aspect of ensuring that you're securing those endpoints and securing that data flow through that two-factor authentication process and checking those identity credentials. In India, historically, 70 to 80% of cybercrime that we've investigated has been financially motivated, but there has been a portion of it that has been associated with intellectual property theft. And at the moment, it would be fair to observe that governments, government institutions, as well as healthcare, specifically those that may be involved in the research or development of vaccines related to the current pandemic, would become prime targets for cyber attacks, particularly from an IP theft perspective. So that would be another consideration across industries if you are working with or partnering with those organisations, or in fact, if you are one of those organisations, then making sure that the right questions are being asked at the very senior levels of the company to ensure that the cyber policy and the security posture is strengthened in this period as well. And the final piece that we would speak about and observe, particular to cybersecurity, is really in the financial services sector. Sanchit touched on the fact that the SARS epidemic was a springboard for e-commerce providers Demonetization was a springboard for digital payments and digital payment platforms in India. It's reasonable to assume that they will accelerate again as we look to come out of the current pandemic response. And so the Reserve Bank of India has commented previously on standards such as PCI DSS, digital security standards for payment card industries. Adoption of these across the industry are a strong set of compliance protocols and security protocols as organizations start to move and leverage that digitization of customer interactions that has come as part of their response to the pandemic overall. So in summary, when we look at this period of time, we are absolutely in an extraordinary set of circumstances. And if any of us had have contemplated in December last year that we would be living under this particular set of circumstances and operating our businesses as we are today, it would have been incredibly far-fetched. Yet here we are. And so our focus, firstly, as an organisation globally, is on the health and welfare of our employees and ensuring that people are safe and have access to work tools and work products in a safe environment. That's priority number one. The second one is to help enterprises and governments around the world respond and react and ensure that their business is viable as they revive, recover, and then return to regular trading conditions as we emerge from this pandemic period as well. That's our focus internationally for Verizon Enterprise. That's certainly my focus for the Asia Pacific region, and that is absolutely the focus of the Verizon team in India as well. So Sanchit, Muntazir, I'll pass back to you, and perhaps there might be some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for your insights. Sanchit, do you have any question?
Yeah, so I'll sort of have the unfair advantage of asking you the first question, Rob. So, there is a sort of a conundrum, if you may, in the industry. One, as you rightly said, most clients are coming out cash-strapped out of this. There's no capital to work with. So this entire theme of doing more with less will sort of come back with vengeance. But at the same time, you see organizations have a lot to manage from a changed and evolved security posture. So if you speak to any chief risk officer today, they're very scared and worried about introducing more digital. Now it's inevitable, but there's no clear answer or guidance as to how do you sort of do more with less, at the same time manage increased risk. And the third angle to consider here is that there is ample time lost in the last 6 months, and there's going to be more time lost here on. Clearly, because expenditures are going to be higher, cash flows are going to be lesser, and revenue recognition is going to be lower as well. So with all these sort of confluence of forces, how does, let's say, give let's say more actionable on the ground 5 examples, or let's say 3 examples of how organizations can adopt more technology purely from a security standpoint and still facilitate business? Because ultimately, what we need to keep in mind as providers is that consumer habits will change permanently here on. Because we're never going back to a state where social distancing will not be the norm. Sort of health will always be a priority. Handshakes will be less, all of that. So, the mindset will change really. So in the sort of broad sort of perspective of that, what do you think of 3 or 5 actionable items for organizations?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sanchit. It's a great observation. Firstly, I would tell you that that relationship between risk, security, and growth has been there in organizations well before the COVID-19 pandemic. What I think has occurred is that it has magnified, that dimension and that positive tension in many organizations. And it's caused many companies to ask and to have more insightful discussions and questions about which of those is more important. And the real answer is it's different for every industry and it's different for every organization. But one of the areas that I think will be, probably one of the first across many industry segments that will be a consideration for organizations as they seek to recover and revive is that of the customer experience. And how do I take either this forced change in customer experience and accelerate that to gain greater benefit, or how do I meaningfully change that so that customers are interacting with me in a very different way? And what role does technology play in that? I'll give you some simple examples. At a local level, here in Australia, many restaurants and bars have been forced to close for a period of time, perhaps similar in parts of India as well. Many of those companies or those small retail outlets have had to very rapidly transform their business to an e-commerce platform where I can order takeaway, food online and go to the outlet, pick it up or have it delivered to my home. So that's a complete shift in business model very rapidly. But what it does do is it creates a different way for you to then interact with your customers and for them to then procure your products and services. And so the question that would obviously need to be asked is, once we revive and recover out of the pandemic response, is that a portion of my business that I wish to retain? Is there benefit and profitability to be gained by that? Is there net incremental growth that I can achieve from that particular model? Or do I need to very purposely shift back to my previous way of trading because that's where I felt that I got the strongest return? At a macro level, for large organizations, it's those questions around, is this the opportunity to transform my legacy infrastructure, to transform my contact center, move to a cloud-based omni-channel model so that I have a unified customer experience all the way through the digital journey and then into the physical journey as well. So can I leapfrog certain levels of incremental investment that I may have made previously, or can I use the opportunity to completely change the way that I'm looking at my business model also? The other key area that we would always talk to customers about is that applications and software and digital experience and digital platforms are nothing if they don't run over a reliable, robust, application-aware network. And so infrastructure is becoming more important now than it probably has been for many years for organizations. And so as they seek to revive, looking at new ways that they can think about their infrastructure, their networking architecture, and is there an opportunity for them to change that, adopt new networking technologies and network architecture to then set them up for that success and that change as well. So there's a few key areas there, Sanchit, around customer experience and technology transformation, around infrastructure and networks to ensure that they're right-sized and they're fit for purpose for whatever that new world is. And then there's technology's role in business model change. And that's a decision that needs to be made almost on an enterprise by enterprise basis.
I think that's some great points, Rob. Thank you. But I think just to add to what you just said, I think the focus on data for organizations must catapult here on. And the reason I say that is because there are lessons to be learned from the telco world. Back in time, telcos would sort of manage their own towers, but they figured over time that counterproductive. So all in the telco world sort of got together to sort of work on the infrastructure, the towers at a common layer, so they share those towers. And the battle really happens on the data and how they use their data a lot better to manage their customers from an ARPU perspective and now data perspective. So I think the quicker that organizations do a lot more with their data, because the fact is that the financial markets are very choppy. And as an economist, you cannot really take cues from such a choppy market. You're better off sort of reading the data that you have internally, taking cues of how you've sort of managed to come out of crisis as an organization in the past, because there are nuances that would sort of come out from that data that sort of tell you a tale of what really works for your organization.
You're exactly right, Sanchit. And one of the other things to consider here is there is no doubt that new business models will emerge. New business models, new profitability and cost models within existing businesses, and new service models as well. And as you referenced earlier, technology will play a central part to all of those as organizations seek to establish a new normal and a new way to sustain growth in these changed market conditions. So if we just think about an example, digital payment sector, and the robust growth that has been occurring in that sector, the new trading models and the role of payment systems in smart city infrastructure, as we all seek for a social distancing type of interaction, or simple things like as citizens go about their daily lives, are there ways that these payment platforms combined with smart city technology can create contactless interactions, whether it's with transportation or retail or other services in their environment. We perhaps will see those sorts of things emerge. That's one example. There would be many others across industry segments that perhaps haven't even been fully imagined just yet.
I'll give you a great example. I was on a call yesterday with the head of strategy for one of India's largest conglomerates, and his question was very interesting. He said, look, we produce a vehicle, and I'm not going to specify the vehicle because otherwise people will guess the customer name. So we produce a vehicle every few seconds. So they are the largest manufacturer of vehicles in the world, by the way. Each year they produce 20 billion data points. Now, with 20 billion data points being produced every single year, their question to me was very specific. They said, look, we understand manufacturing is going to go through its own troughs and peaks over the next 6, 9, 12 months. So how can we sort of use this data to probably sort of come up with a new business model wherein we share this data with insurers, we share this data with, let's say, other sort of service organizations, which then sort of sell service packages on this vehicle and sort of sell insurance packages. So it's a great example of how even a very traditional industry, which is manufacturing, fairly evolved in terms of technology adoption, but sort of still looking at brand new business models, which are a complete departure from its past business.
Exactly. Yeah, that's another great example. And there are many across industry segments about reimagined commercial models, but then also the other aspect is around workforce deployment and what the workforce of the future might look like, and whether there is a future for consistently distributed workforces using remote collaboration technologies as part of the fabric of how you do business. I think that what this period has demonstrated is that business can continue, transactions can continue, enterprise can continue trading on collaboration tools and collaboration platforms. And so, there's a role for that to play into the future. And then that then brings in many considerations around consolidation of other fixed cost assets within a business, like real estate and things of that nature. So there's a lot of opportunity as there is disruption. And the challenge for organizations, we believe, will be distilling the difference between the two, but then most importantly, understanding what technology's role will be in being able to allow you to respond to both.
Yeah, it's a great example. So I hand it over to Muntazi now. Otherwise, I can go on for the next 20 minutes and take over the session.
Sure.
So, Rob, we have one question. Like 5G is something that large enterprises, organizations were looking at very aggressively, but due to this pandemic and lockdown, so they have slightly changed their strategy. So, are you in touch with such enterprise customers and what they are seeing and what they are anticipating about this new technology?
Yeah, great question, Muntazir. So 5G technology, we have a 5G network in the United States, and we've been very aggressive in establishing global leadership in 5G technology over the last period of time. As I mentioned in my comments earlier, the question that we're being asked and the discussion we're having with customers right now around 5G technology is actually, how can 5G technology accelerate my change agenda? How do I use these forced change in trading conditions to look at new breakthrough technologies that can help me to transform my business? 5G is clearly one of those. And there is absolutely a future for the technology as organizations reimagine, again, their customer interactions. They reimagine how they might manufacture services into the future. They reimagine how their teams might collaborate and communicate, not only across cities, but across borders and and around the world. This technology has a key role to play in that. Many of the use cases that we've worked on enabling enterprises to fundamentally change their business models. So we see that as a key enabler to business transformation, in the same way that we see customer experience technology, omni-channel contact center and experience platforms for consumers and enterprise customers changing fundamentally the way that you or I as consumers interact with organizations, but also the way that enterprises do business as well. We see it as a great opportunity.
Okay, sure. So Sanchit, one question to you. I mean, as a research and advisory firm, what are the best practices that you are suggesting to your enterprise customers, or maybe for the people who are now working from home? So what
Right.
essentially are the key, considerations?
That's a great question. Thank you. So I think, we've seen a clear evolution starting from where we were in February to where we are today. In February, the best practices were more around three core aspects, the people aspect and the cultural aspect. Because look, there are businesses which have never worked remotely, which don't quite understand the entire concept of remote collaboration. There are businesses, for example, which use consume a ton of videos. How do you sort of do video editing remotely? Because that's a task which cannot be done remotely given the need for bandwidth and file sharing and all of that. So I think there's been a great migration. So, but today where we stand, there are 5 key things that I talk about in every inquiry call. We've done about 100 so far. The 5 things that are, which is one, is absolute need to regain lost revenue. Look, time and again, what's happened, every crisis has taught us, be it, let's say, a financial crisis, or be it, let's say, a health crisis, is that the one that has the best cash flow wins. This is not the time to focus purely and solely on the top line. This is the time to preserve cash. So the more you're able to preserve cash, the longer you will be in business for. That's the first key thing that we talk about. Second thing we talk about is this theme around doing more with less. And you won't believe, the every call that I spoke about doing more with less, there was a sigh of relief, because that's a key theme that they hear from their CFOs. Again, I'll give you a classic example of a hospitality firm we are closely working with right now. So they have a decent looking website, but all of a sudden, the chief revenue officer needs a brand new website, and there's an entire conflict within the organization from the technology guy who says, look, new website is equal to new costs. Where we came and sort of helped them was to establish clear revenue and outcomes around how a new website, and more importantly, a customer journey, can help you monetize better. So, for example, the way you think about a website should no more be about bookings. It should be about how do we navigate wherever the customer is coming from, be it offline to online or online to offline. We have to think about customer journeys and how do we optimize customer journeys. Remember what I spoke to Robert about, the fact that customer behavior has changed. All of a sudden, what we realize is that we have in India what we call as the sachet mentality. It goes back in time in the 70s and the 80s, where, because there was always, cash was an issue for most of us, and we were doing more daily wages. So we wouldn't go for large bottles and packs. We would actually go in for sachets. So this entire sachet mentality as to, can we buy less right now? Can we do more with less right now? Can we stock up stuff which is only essentials? So the focus on getting essentials for as a consumer is going to be very, very high, especially in a country like India and Brazil and Philippines, where the poverty line is very high. The percentage of population is 20, 30, 40% of population is below the poverty line. So there's enough and more to be done in these markets. So there's going to be higher sensitivity. So when organizations do look at these large projects around, let's say, modernizing a revenue engine or modernizing, let's say, a website, I think the ultimate goal of how it sort of facilitates a customer journey and ultimately leads to new revenues are things to be thought about. The third thing I think, which is very critical, that is sort of joined at the hip with the concept of doing more with less, is delivering customer experience like never before. although this is a topic that many will talk about and say that, look, been sort of spoken to death in the last 5 years, but I think CX will go through a massive change. And I think one of the first concepts that we speak to our customers about is that, look, the customer is always not necessarily going to be an external facing customer. What organizations need to think about today are internal facing customers, for example, all the business users. So unless you have great applications that facilitate the job of a business user, which is your first consumer, by the way, you're never going to be productive. So again, I love sharing examples. I'll share another example. There's a very interesting large insurance firm that has although allowed work from home, but doesn't allow USB access, doesn't allow WeTransfer access, doesn't allow YouTube access. So how simple things like even an IT policy upgrade can go a long way in actually helping you deal with your first level customers in a much better fashion. And that's the third key thing to think about. The fourth key trend that is coming out again and again, and again, we spoke about this with Rob as well, is a brand new approach to data management. Now again, this is a topic that is not new, but the reason it needs to be taken as new is because there's going to be big winners and there's going to be big losers from this entire episode. And those who actually end up losing big are the ones that cannot afford to continue to have capex, they cannot afford to continue to sort of fight everyday battles. So what they need to do is sort of let go at some stage of infrastructure and probably move it to the cloud. Probably, let's say, start sharing infrastructure and basics with, let's say, others in their ecosystem. So this entire concept about co-opetition will have to sort of come back very strongly. And where these organizations will have to come out and focus on is on data. How do they focus on data and sort of come out as leaner organizations? How do they come up with new business models, for example? I think because India loves startups, so I'll give you an example from startups. Zomato now wants to buy Grofers. Who would have thought of that 3 months ago? They were sort of in at Lockhorns 3 months ago. So the fact is that there's going to be a lot of folding within the sectors. There's going to be what I call as a duopoly. There's going to be two key market leaders, and there's going to be a long tail around that. If you look at any mature market, that's how any industry has sort of come out. Look at, let's say, e-commerce in the US. There is Amazon and there is Walmart, and then there's the long tail. If even in India, for example, if you look at, let's say, the entire food tech business, there's Zomato and there was Uber Eats. Uber Eats again was acquired by Zomato. So what you're seeing increasingly is that there's a folding of businesses, and that's all the more reason that younger businesses, leaner businesses must focus on brand new data management practices so that they can evolve in their business model very quickly. Last but not the least, I'd love to sort of, in each advisory call that we speak about, I always sort of enforce the need to sort of let loose and sort of give some more space around the risk postures, because the chief risk officers typically in large environments are very picky and choosy about risk. Because the fact is that in the morning, let's say the share prices are topping down, your chairman and CEO is not going to hear about risk policies and security policies. All they care about is share prices going up. So the chief risk officer has a very big task in this entire pandemic scenario. And I think it's somewhere the chief risk officer isn't being brought into these conversations. So as technologists, one of the key things I talk about is how we need to have the chief risk officer as part of the center of excellence, or let's say on the table, and speak about an evolved risk posture that is a non-negotiable, because the fact is you cannot stop using digital technologies here on. You have to probably have a new mindset around this. Now, a great example of this is the BPO sector. Now, why is that a great example? Because a ton of financial services organizations, hotel chains, a lot of these hospitals are very wary about customer data, and rightfully they should be. But there needs to be a paradigm shift, because the fact is, in each of these industries, you have to outsource. You have to, let's say, hire a third party to do your tasks. So the fact is, a lot of these things aren't necessarily driven by compliance. They're driven by an internal outlook to risk. And if that changes, a lot of these things will change as well. So these are 5 key things we speak about to most of our customers.
Thank you, Sanchit, for your insightful address. Rob, I may come again to you. So there is one question from Rita Chaudhary. She's asking how the platforms like Zoom are safe in the wake of most people are moving towards such sort of meeting platforms. In the wake of current lockdown, so how these platforms are safe enough to secure data on your devices, safe and secure.
Yeah, great question. A very topical question at the moment. So I'm aware that there's been some discussion in the press more broadly about security concerns related to some of the collaboration platforms, and Zoom has been mentioned in that context. I think it goes back to what I said earlier around that initial response. So how do I survive and shore up my defences operationally in the early stages of pandemic response? And how do I answer that fundamental question? Can my workforce continue to communicate and collaborate? And there are a variety of different methods and tools available in order for you to do that. Interestingly, one of the key areas of traffic that we monitor and manage and look at is IP voice. So that's IP voice traffic running over the internet, and that IP voice traffic across the Asia Pacific region is up some 100 to 120%. Similarly, we've seen an almost doubling and again of VPN access traffic also. So we're seeing really significant uplifts in data transit around the region. And with all of that comes the requirement to make sure that those communications are secure. So thinking about first and foremost what I mentioned earlier, two-factor authentication for VPN is critical. The second one is selection of collaboration tools that are password protected and use unique password and access user access controls is also important as well. The key consideration here is not the platform necessarily or the technology selection, but the policy around usage. And one of the things that we've been working a lot with many customers about is establishing these collaboration platforms, but then helping them to understand the policies and controls that they would use and the sorts of information that might be shared over those collaboration platforms as well. Again, that's quite specific to an organization. You know, customer data is also always very sensitive, and any organization must consider very carefully how that is represented and shared, particularly if it's going outside of the traditional corporate network. Payment information, things of that nature that is sensitive. We talk about this particular challenge with organizations as asking them to try and identify the crown jewels in terms of data and information for their business. You know, what is that information that provides that central competitive advantage or really critical aspect of your customer relationships, and making sure that you have a really clear view of what that information is, and then you can set appropriate security protocols around it. So selection of platform is one thing. Of equal importance is policy and understanding where your data is going and which data you're allowing to be used on those collaboration platforms as well.
Sure.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
It's a very pertinent point what just Rob pointed out. In fact, 3 of the ITS companies that we recently worked with, the key problem was the lack of centralization in policy management. There were so many versions of policies floating around. So what we figured out was that the issue was not the lack of policy, it was multiple versions of policies. And as people move out of companies, policies float here and there. So I think centralization is absolutely fundamental. Another issue that we I resonate very well with what Rob said was the automation of the policy rollouts as well and the policy management. A classic example that we recently worked with was this very large insurance firm. So they have a rotating dice rotating roster when it comes to trainers coming in and training, getting trained on new products. And that's how insurance industry moves, where there's a roster moves very quickly. And each time a new employee would walk in, they would have to physically authenticate the application for each new employee. Now imagine 300 employees coming in every single week. That's about 1,200. The fact that that task is not automated, that's a minefield of disaster. One is that. Second thing, again, I would sort of press upon what Robert said, was the 2FA and the MFA issue. A ton of companies, again, have the technology, have actually adopted a ton of applications and have default 2FA and MFA. But the issue is the lack of activation of that MFA in the policy. So sometimes the policy proceeds, sometimes policy doesn't proceed. And I think so I think the point cannot be made enough on redesigning a policy and automating it. The point cannot be made enough on MFA and 2FA. It's not the issue of technology availability, it's the mindset and policy updation, I would say.
Exactly.
Sure. Great, Sanchit. So, Rob, there is one small question from Mr. Vimal Vaklu. He is the former chairman of TCIL in New Delhi. So, he is asking what are the actions that service providers are looking at, to improve their quality of service in the wake of data search. Do you have anything on that?
In the wake of what? Sorry, what was the last part of the question?
Telecom network, data usage, right. Increased data usage.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think we at Verizon, we're very proud of the legacy of investment in our networks around the world that we've articulated for many years. And so we build our networks and invest in our networks so that they are ready for this type of event. And so we're very proud of the fact that our data networks in the Asia Pacific region and around the world have performed almost flawlessly in managing the data uplift and the data load that we've seen running on them at the moment. And it's not an issue that we are seeking to address right now. This is something that we've continued as part of our strategy for many years and will continue to do so into the future. So for us at Verizon, we're very clear on our ability to carry that data and manage that load, particularly around the region. And we have whole teams that look at this on a daily basis, in some cases an hourly basis, to ensure that our network is operating to optimum levels wherever we're serving our customers in the world.
Okay, with that, we are coming to an end. Thank you, gentlemen, for interactive and insightful discussion today. And that will definitely be helpful to enterprise customers.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Much more to say. Thank you, Sanchit. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a great day. Keep safe.
Keep safe, stay healthy.